Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you live again, once again on a Thursday morning about 10 o'clock. Hope everyone's doing good. This is, another show coming live at you from Film Fanatic headquarters. So, yeah, we were supposed to get some snow this weekend, but, well, I'm not a weatherman, so who knows, but the, who knows? This winter's been pretty mild. It's been really warm. I've had some cold snaps, but it's been really mild for the most part. It's funny, I always judge the winter. I'm pretty bad and terrible about looking at the weather forecast. Well, I just kind of feel like you can't really, there's nothing you can do about it. But it also does affect, events or, if there's something happening. We, uh, we live here in Maine and, we're used to, well, at least in the past, of having some pretty harsh winters. But for the most part, it's fairly easy to get around. But it's funny because it's part of our climate here, and I'm always amazed by how people react during the first possibility of a storm or any kind of snowfall. Everybody kind of gets panicky and things get canceled. There was a snow day I've had one snow day so far from work, and it's and it ended up just raining. But people kind of go crazy. I think, well, obviously people, when they're worried about things, when people are afraid, they spend more money. So that has something to do with it too. So, but we never seem to adjust as a society here in Maine or in New England, but especially in Maine, uh, to living in this climate, because there's always this like fear of it, and then also, which always leads to all of these cancellations, even when they're like, premature. When premature decisions are made around that, and then things don't actually end up happening. We don't actually get any snow. But anyway, so yeah, there was talk all yesterday that I was supposed to be getting a snow day, and it's pretty funny because I haven't had a snow day luckily, so I'm not, as far as I know. But anyway, this is a show that I've been wanting to get to actually for a long time, and I talked about it yesterday. I did a show that I uploaded to the channel about this amazing movie I just discovered called Delirium, which is this like killer exploitation movie. And I talked a lot about that film, and that was a first time viewing, and I bought it, and I had not seen it before. Was not familiar with the filmmakers or the director, and I've been, like I've said in previous videos, I've been doing that more, and I've lucked out pretty well. There's only been a couple of movies that I it's funny because it switched a lot. Like originally, and I've talked about it before, but might as well bring it up again. Originally, years and years ago, when I became, when I was in my 20s or so, I always loved film. But when I got in my 20s, when I was in school, and then when I got out of school, and when I got out of college, I developed this like really intense interest in film, and it was due to a couple of friends that I had that were really you know kind of specialists. They knew so much about film. Friends Charlie Hendrick and Sean Russell. Those two dudes were probably the two most like pivotal figures growing up that had such a they were I mean they're basically like encyclopedias of film. With Charlie, it was always with, I mean, the full gamut of weird underground experimental films, films that were, which I didn't even know at the time was a term, but, grindhouse films to a degree, but really obscure films and a lot of foreign films and some horror films. But my friend Sean Russell, he was really steeped in horror films. And so I got both of those worlds. Like I got into a lot of foreign films because of Charlie, and a lot of obscure films, and then also with the horror genre, that expanded a lot through my friend Sean, and that really, and they were also real big. They played giant roles in me developing a love for certain directors, where I, started to, you know, like one example, Stanley Kubrick. I got really turned on to. I, grew up watching The Shining, and that was the only movie, and even today that remains pretty much my favorite Kubrick film. But growing up, that was the only film of his that I had seen, even into college. I didn't see the second film of his was Clockwork Orange, and I didn't see that until I was in college. So it was like a long period of where I knew who he was, and I loved that film growing up. It always scared the crap out of me. But for whatever reason, I never really, took took a trip and explored who this filmmaker was, Stanley Kubrick, and I definitely had never seen any of his other films. So once I saw Clockwork Orange, then I ended up, seeking out all of his other films. But really, due to Sean, I started paying more attention to certain directors, and then that led to me really seeking out, making almost a list of like seeking out all of the films that he made, and that led to other things with me doing the same thing around filmmakers. And with Charlie, it was more around films, and like I said, you know, it gave me a desire to explore more older films, films from the 50s and 60s, and films that had a little bit more of a experimental edge. Like directors that I got into, or films by certain directors that I got into, were films by like say the famous artist Andy Warhol, and also like John Cassavetes. I got into a lot of David Lynch through him. So a lot of experimental stuff, a lot of underground stuff. So it was a cool culmination. And ever since then, that's kind of how I've been operating, where I've gotten into more and more directors and films. And if I like a film, I'll try to make a list or even seek out a bunch of other films from that director. So that's kind of usually how I operate as far as taking those deep dives. And around that time in my 20s, I became really into film. I got really into film, and it became a new thing for me of like, wow, okay, I want to start buying these movies. And I just bought my own like DVD player. I started to build, if you want to call it, my first man cave. I went out and I bought pretty decent TV, a pretty nice DVD player at the time, and I got a Daewoo surround sound system. So I had a pretty cool little setup for movies, and then I started buying movies. I started buying movies I used to always watch. The first few movies that I bought on DVD were films like Blade Runner, um, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2001, Space Odyssey, also by Kubrick. There was like a handful of films that I used to watch all the time, and then that led to me, going out and becoming a pretty serious buyer of films. I started to buy DVDs left and right, and within a year or two, I started to have a pretty decent collection. And for years after that, it increased. But I had this habit of only buying movies that I had seen before, because I'd only seen them maybe on cable growing up, or on VHS. So they're always like pretty bad quality. When the whole DVD at that time, which was looked at as this like revolution in technology, suddenly you can see just an amazing representation of like a film like The Shining on DVD, and it was like seeing it in this high definition quality with incredible sound, and having a surround sound system was you know really gave you an experience. And I was really late to the game many years later. After that, I was really late to the game to Blu-ray. I At that point when Blu-ray started to come out, I had a pretty large collection of movies, and I was reluctant because I didn't want to have to spend more money for movies that I already owned on DVD. So I had this funny thing about it. And then I don't know what what really transpired, but one day I was over someone's house and I saw a couple of movies. They had one or two films that I had seen before on Blu-ray, and I was just completely blown away by the quality of the picture and the sound, and I was like, I'm hooked. And it was at the tail end of the whole, because when Blu-ray came out, it really exploded, and I knew people that were into film, and they made that big transition where they stopped buying DVDs, and then they were just going full bore into purchasing Blu-rays because of the quality. And at that time, Blu-rays were very expensive, so that was another factor. But like everything, they eventually come down to a degree in prices. So, but I was like really against, like, oh, I don't want to have to buy like a third or fourth copy now, because I already, like, for example, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I have that on VHS. I have multiple copies of that on DVD. I have like the standard version. I have a director's cut, and then I have this other cut which is in a steelbook on DVD, which is like you know comes with a couple of discs, and it's got these documentaries. So there's like three or four versions of the film. So I was like, oh, I don't want to have to buy this movie again on Blu-ray and blah blah blah. So I had all that reluctancy about that and where I'm going to put all this stuff. And but once I got bit by that bug by Blu-ray, I was like, this is the way to go. And at that time, Blu-ray was looked at as the next thing, and that DVD was going to fall by the wayside, which it eventually did. But Blu-ray didn't quite take off. It didn't have the explosion that DVD had. DVD came out and was huge, and it lasted for maybe, I don't know, roughly 10 or 12 years where that was the thing, and it was huge. And a lot of releases were coming out. There were all these great packages of a lot of the filmmakers and companies were putting a lot of love and care into putting out these beautiful packages of the films loaded with special features and bonus discs and all this stuff. And then Blu-ray came along, and that was looked at that was going to be the next thing, and it was really huge. And DVD sales started to plummet, and Blu-ray was around for like maybe 3 or 4 years where it was huge, and that was looked at that was going to replace DVD. But then the Blu-ray thing kind of went by the wayside. It didn't quite take off like it did for some reason. I don't know if it had. I mean, there's probably a few different factors as to why that was the case, but I think it might have been the prices. The prices were expensive. DVDs went on. They started going on the cheaper side. As far as being able to buy new ones, prices dropped relatively soon on those. And so now we're at a state, and then a few years ago, now the new thing is 4K, and 4K is like more. 4K isn't going to be, what Blu-ray is or DVD, and especially DVD, as far as like the commercial boom that that format was, especially DVD, and initially Blu-ray, because those are more expensive, and it requires you to have a special kind of TV and a special setup, and there just isn't that interest, I feel like, for the mass audience or the mass market, for there to be, for a person to change their habits around that. 4K is the next thing, so it's around, but it's not, like you can't really rent 4K movies anywhere if video stores even exist anymore. It's all the majority of everything is streaming, so it's a weird time. But during that whole time, and even up until like maybe a year or two ago, I always got in this habit of just buying movies I've seen before and movies that I was familiar with, and I wanted to just see them in this new, really great quality, a higher updated version of the films that I already owned. Um, so, but then I don't know, for whatever reason, like fairly recently, like the last 2 years or so, I started to buy more movies on Blu-ray, and I decided to really take a chance. I started to buy movies that I had not really seen before. And now when I buy movies, that's mostly what ends up happening. I buy a few releases that I remember kind of from my childhood, or maybe seeing it in that vicinity or after. But generally, I go out and I buy movies, buy Blu-rays that I've never seen before, and I've really lucked out. I've been really blown away by how much that's worked out. There's only been a couple of movies that I've bought that I've been a little bit disappointed in, but I still think they're pretty good. And considering I've been buying a lot of movies, and considering the chance I'm taking, I've lucked out really well. And Delirium was one of those movies that I bought, and I was totally blown away by. One of the things that helps now when I buy movies that seems to really dial that in better is now, because I've been buying lots of exploitation movies. When I buy Blu-rays, that's I try to only buy those kinds of films. In other locations like Goodwill or secondhand stores or whatnot, I'll buy more kind of commercial films on Blu-ray because I love those too. Like for example, the Marvel movies. I acquired pretty much all the Marvel movies fairly recently on Blu-ray, thanks to the Goodwill in Rockland. But when I buy new movies on Blu-ray, I try to buy pretty obscure titles and a lot of horror exploitation movies and exploitation movies in general. I love all styles, but that style is my favorite genre. And I also feel like there's all of these great films that came out, and a lot of them went into total obscurity, and they're no one's really seen them before. So I've kind of been obsessed with that whole kind of idea, exploring that world, and I've really been loving that world. So, and the prices are great, and I feel like a lot of these films could go back, into obscurity again. So I've been buying them a lot, and I'm not just a collector. I collect movies. That's a big hobby of mine. It's a big passion of mine. But I also watch everything I buy, and I try to do shows on the films that I really love. Some people who are into it are just primarily collectors, and they do love film, but they a lot of the times they just buy things in bulk from say, like for example, Severin. They go to their website and they just like get a whole shipment of those, and they don't tend to really watch a lot of those films. Even though they love them, they just kind of acquire all of this stuff. And I like to buy them and actually sit down and watch them, and then if I'm into them, I'll watch them numerous times. So I'm a collector, but then I'm also like, a fan, and I guess you want to call it a connoisseur of films. And when I talked yesterday, and I did my show on this amazing new discovery, Delirium, which is just an outstanding movie. Highly recommend it. Anybody out there, check it out. I talked about one of the things I loved about that film so much was how it felt like. I mean, not only is it's so incredibly raw and nasty and dirty and sleazy, but it feels like a documentary. And the first part of the movie, the first act or the first two acts of the film is kind of centered around this serial killer. And I had said during that show that it really reminded me at times of one of my all-time favorite movies that's dealing with serial killers. It really reminded me of Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. So that's what today's show is going to be about. And this is it right here. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. This movie is just, I think, when people make lists or they talk about horror films, and then, they talk about, I think there's two facets of it. Movies, fans of horror films, like people love well, I think the core of being a horror fan, like sometimes I had a friend or somebody ask me recently, like, what, what do you love about horror so much? Like, what is it? Because it's like it's dark, and movies tend to be really dark and ominous and violent and brutal and just scary. Not really something that is, I don't know, for some people to be like a soothing, relaxing experience. But I look at it as it's on one front, or two tiers, or two on two different in two different aspects. I look at it as, it's like the ultimate roller coaster. Like you're taken away from like this your everyday mundane experience, and you have these scares and chills, while you're experiencing it, and it's fun, and it's the amusement aspect of it, like the amusement park ride aspect of it, and it's a roller coaster. It takes you out of the your regular everyday experience, and it makes you feel alive, and it's fun. And I feel like for me, that's what it is. I mean, that's at the core of as to why I love and why I'm obsessed with horror films. And also what comes along with it, I've always been attracted to things with a dark nature. I've always felt like that's been an aesthetic I've always been attracted to since I was a kid. But it's mainly that feeling of going on a amusement ride where there's like screams and total immersion in this like intense experience. So a lot of people talk, films about horror films where they provide that experience, and they where it's like just a full throttle thrill ride. You go on like I said as an example, you go on a to an amusement park, or you go to a haunted house, a simulated haunted house, um, and but then horror films too. Uh, a lot of the time, like some of those films aren't necessarily, I guess you could say, are not necessarily scary in terms of where they generally unsettle you, or they give you an experience where it's generally frightening and unsettling, and can really kind of push your own boundaries as far as like your comfort level. There's certain horror films out there that can really get under your skin and really creep you out, or generally scare you, and it can be a little bit more of, it's still a thrill ride, but it can be a little bit more of a deeper kind of primal experience. And sometimes, like, you can love lots of horror films. Like, there's a lot of horror films I love that are not necessarily, say, scary or terrifying in that way. Like, I think, like, a film, one example I would think of, or two examples that I can think of, kind of what I mean is like, say, Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. Like that's one of the all-time classics, one of my all-time favorite movies. I'm thinking about doing a series on the Evil Dead movies, because the trailer was just dropped for the new Evil Dead movie that's coming out in, I believe, March of this year, which looks really impressive. And I really actually loved. I'm not always a huge fan of remakes, but I really loved the last movie in the franchise, which was a remake, but completely different and new and original. So I was really blown away by that trailer. So I'm thinking about doing a show or another series on all of the Evil Dead movies, because I do love all of the films, especially the first one. But I think like Sam Raimi's Evil Dead is a film that is definitely, it's very scary. It's got, in a lot of ways, it's got um, that thrill ride, and it's super fun. It's super campy. It's got this great cheese factor, but it's really entertaining. It's just like super entertaining in a kind of a horrific way. But but then I look at a movie, say like, for example, another horror film that I feel causes me to react differently is, say, for The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which, like I said in the beginning of the show, is uh, probably my favorite film of his. I love all of his films to death, but The Shining is probably my all-time favorite. And I feel like The Shining, that is an example of a movie that generally there are scenes and there are situations in that film that I feel are just utterly terrifying, and they get under this they those situations or some of those scenes in that film generally get under your skin and can give you like nightmares or just penetrate you at a different level where they're just the imagery and the way it's shot, uh, certain aspects of that film are just strike you at a different level, a deeper level where it reaches like this primal kind of thing. And I feel like there's films like that, that do that, and I think that's a difference between those two kinds of films. But again, they're both in the horror genre. I think another film that is really generally piercing that way is The Exorcist, the original Exorcist. Exorcist. I think that's a film that generally gets under your skin and really, can be a thing of what nightmares are made of. Um, I just think that that's, movies that hit you in that primal level, and I feel like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer is definitely one of those movies. I think it's generally one of the most disturbing and I think scary movies ever made. I mean, even on the list or even on the cover of this, there's a big review and it says easily one of the top 20 scariest movies of all time. And it's definitely one of those films that like gets under your skin and it really uh, strikes a chord of where it's not just entertainment. It hits you on a level that is uh, that kind of rings this bell on you inside of you that certain films just don't do that. Another film I think that operates on that level is the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Again, it's very similar. I feel to I think that Texas was a huge influence on this film, just because it feels like a documentary and it just hits you and strikes this chord on this at this different level where it goes beyond just kind of it goes beyond the entertainment factor of the film. And this film was it came out in 1990, which is hard to believe, and it was directed by John Mcnaughton. The cast in this film is just incredible. John Mcnaughton wrote and directed this. Michael Rooker, who has gone on to be a star in the Guardians of the Galaxy films, uh, I think he's like one of the greatest actors really around. He's a real character actor. He can throw himself in so many things. He I know one of my favorite films of his is by James Gunn called Slither, a really great black comedy sci-fi movie. He's incredibly funny in that movie. He's got so much versatility as an actor. He can play these really dramatic roles. Like he was in The Walking Dead for a while, and he was this really kind of you know played this really serious like kind of melodramatic character in that. And then also with the Guardians of the Galaxy films, it's hard to believe, where he plays this incredible, lovable character, but it's hard to believe that like this is the same guy that played, Henry Lee Lucas. Uh, but he's one of my favorite actors. I mean, he's always been, and it's amazing to see where his career has gone. It also this film, Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, also stars Tracy Arnold, Mary DeMoss, and Tom Oles, who plays Otis. Um, just just an amazing movie. It's truly, I think that the whole centerpiece of this film too is kind of really centered on that fear that people have of home invasion. A lot of people feel that way, and I do too. I think in realistic terms or in real life terms, the idea of having your house invaded and you being kept as a prisoner in your own home is one of the most terrifying things you can possibly think of happening to you or your loved ones. And I think that that's you know um, again, that's one of those things that strikes a chord in reality. And this film is the way it's shot. It feels like a documentary. From the opening scene, which is incredibly disturbing, you feel like it was shot on like a VHS camera. I mean, it just has this grittiness to it, and the story itself is it's basically uh, this movie's loosely based on the real life serial killers of Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, and they were two incredibly notorious serial killers. And with Henry Lee Lucas at one point claiming that he had killed upwards to almost 200 people. And the thing with Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, particularly around Henry Lee Lucas, was he traveled during his crimes. He traveled across the United States. He wasn't just in one particular city or one area. He traveled across and was committed all these monstrous acts. Um, and there's one scene in this film that, um, and again, getting back to that fear of the home invasion scene, but there's a scene in the film of where the two characters, Henry Lucas and Otis, they acquire this VHS camcorder and they decide to start recording their crimes. And there's a scene where there's a home invasion uh, scenario where they're in this house and there's a daughter or a son and these two parents, and they're both in the house and they record them basically massacring these people. And it's like I've seen this movie so many times because I love this movie to death, but that scene I feel is like just so hard to watch. I mean, it's so brutal. It feels so real, and it's not. There's not necessarily any gore per se. It's not like a slasher film. It's not in like a slasher kind of style, even though I feel like it is. And I kind of you know put this in my category of underground, exploitation, group of films. I kind of put it just because of the low budget nature of it, and it's so raw and it's so dirty. So to me, it kind of does fit in that world to a degree. So I always kind of, when I think of this movie, or I put it like, say for instance, where I put it on my shelf, I put it in there with all of the other films like that are quote unquote exploitation movies because I kind of just feel it is kind of in that world. But it just feels like you're really seeing these people getting killed on screen, and it's really horrific. It's a movie that's not for the faint at heart, and like I said, there are certain scenes in this film that raise this movie to a level of where it's truly terrifying. And it's there, and the fact too that this movie was loosely based on two true life, monsters makes it even more unsettling that there are actually, people in this world that do these things. And they also, John Mcnaughton does such an amazing job with like kind of exploring the kind of the psychotic nature of how they are. There's one scene in the film I highly recommend it, but without giving anything away. But there's one scene where Henry Lucas and Otis go out on the town and they basically go out to clubs looking for women to hook up with. And there's a scene of where they pick up these two women and they take them in their car and they drive away, and then they kill both of them. They break both of their necks and they're in their car, and it's just like god awful and just so brutal. And they just take their bodies and just throw them out in this dumpster like they're trash. And then the next couple of scenes is them just like sitting in their car, eating cheeseburgers and drinking coffee, and they're just like, it's just a regular night for them. They're just, there's no like sense of remorse or under coming to terms with like the horrific things that they did. There's a whole thing too where Henry Lee Lucas is kind of pushing Otis to try to see if he is capable of murdering people, and so what they decide to do is they pull up under this bridge, there's a guy who is pulled over because he's having car problems. Just some random guy, and they pull up behind him, trying to set up the scenario that they're going to help him. But they basically he gives Henry Lucas gives Otis a handgun, and he just shoots him and executes him just so he can see if he could do it and how it would feel. And again, there's no empathy, no remorse, pure, just a great. You really get a sense of how of their psychopathic nature, uh, and how they have no empathy at all for humans, and they're pure predators. But so those scenes in that film are just so brutal, and again, it's not really similar again to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it's not necessarily uh, a slasher film where there's copious amounts of blood or like say creative kills or over the top kills. It's just so like raw and very realistic that uh, like Texas that it's very much a psychological journey that you really get this like the movie is or says it even in the title. You get this portrait of what how this person kind of functions and how this person can somehow be in our society. Um, just an incredible movie. I think it's as far as films that are out there that are portrayals or about say serial killers. One of my all time favorites, and it might be my favorite, is like Silence of the Lambs. I just think that is just one of the greatest movies ever made, and also a terrifying movie. I think that movie is actually legitimately scary at times. And it's that movie too was really the only horror movie that I can think of that really got incredible you know acclaim or acceptance by say the Academy Awards. But Henry Lee Lucas is right up there with it. A very different kind of a movie. The style is very different, but I just think those that Silence of the Lambs and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer are probably the two greatest film adaptations of a serial killer. Um, and particularly with Henry's, it's loosely based on true events. The This Blu-ray package is just incredible. It comes with all these great interviews with John Mcnaughton and with the cast, just incredible. And they really go into how they, you know, basically had no budget when they made this movie, and I just think it really adds to the grittiness of this film, and it just takes it to another level of uncompromising realness, and it just really generally gets under your skin. It really it's truly an unsettling experience, and I think on every level. There's about an hour on this is like an hour interview with John McNaughton, and he also did this other film which I bought last year, which I'll eventually do a show, which is this movie called The Borrower, which came out after a year or two after Henry did, which is a crazy bonkers like sci-fi exploitation movie, super awesome movie. And he's just a super talented guy. He also directed Wild Things, which is a pretty awesome movie. Um, and with Nev Campbell and Matt Dillon, that's a killer movie. I always forget that he did that movie. He did also Mad Dog and Glory, which came out in 1993, The Harvest, 2013, and then 2001, speaking of sex, The Borrower, and also Normal Life, which came out in 96. Um, he also did Firehouse, Road Rage, Lansky, and also The King. Um, and as far as I know, I think he's still active, but amazing director. I like I said, I bought the other film of his, The Borrower. I have that on Blu-ray, and that's an incredible movie. That movie's bonkers. Definitely like a weirdo science fiction horror exploitation movie, but it's really wild, completely different than this in every way. But if you've never seen this film, I highly recommend it. It's one of the greatest horror movies ever, like legitimately. And I think it's definitely, like I said, mentioned in the top of the show, of like films that are truly scary films in the horror genre. This is definitely one of them. I mean, definitely up there with like The Exorcist or like The Shining. Other films I can think of, like as far as maybe more recent, like The Babadook. Um, just a really intense experience. But you have to be forewarned because it's brutal as all hell and it's a really disturbing movie. So it's not for the faint of heart. It's not for everyone. I think a lot of people would probably have a hard time watching this movie. Like I said, even when I watch this film now, there's that home invasion scene that is I generally there's always a moment where I'm watching where I get like intent I get tense and I have this like swell of apprehension come over me where I'm like, I don't know if I can watch this because it's just so like messed up. And I have a high threshold for seeing things on screen that don't usually bother me. So, that I guess that says something. But amazing movie, one of my all-time favorite movies, definitely one of my all-time favorite horror films. One of the truly, one of the most truly terrifying experiences that you would have with a horror film. John Mcnaughton is such an amazingly talented director and writer. So I highly recommend this. If you've never seen it, check it out. But to a degree, be forewarned. So this is Jason Dean, and I'm going to be signing off here. And have a great day. And please check out this movie if you get a chance. All right. And if you like and subscribe, if you like this channel, please like and subscribe to it. It's really greatly appreciated. I love that people have been checking us out more and more. And the thing that I love even more now is that people are commenting more on the videos. So I've been in correspondence with a lot more people around these crazy films, and that's to me is my favorite part of it. Um, so we'll see you next time. Peace. Have a great day.